Hey there, and welcome to episode number 8, I think, of the series Irony is the Truest Medicine. I've been all over the map. I recognize that. A lot of people would have trouble following what I'm trying to say and might even think I'm a bit of a madman for drawing connections all the way from chemical origins of life to an ironic attitude, let's say, in modern everyday life and politics. I understand. I am making unfamiliar connections. The reason I'm doing it, though, there is some method to my madness, I think, or at least I'd like to argue there is. And here's the method. I want to understand what I am. It's a kind of self-awareness or self-discovery, you could say. But I have a problem when I do that. It's actually an ironic problem, which is that I'd really like to know what I am, and then again, I really wouldn't. It would be disappointing to find out what I really am. So there's something about the uncovering. I'd say instead of the romantic sounding self-discovery, I'd say it's self-uncovering. I've got to get realistic about who I am, despite my appetite to hear more encouraging versions of what I am. This is really about self-uncovery, if you can take that. And so, early on in this work, I noticed the irony of my situation, which is no matter how hard I chase the truth about me, it will never catch me because I don't want to know. I think that's true of all of us. I call it autophobia, but I didn't make up the name. We've talked about it before. So there's something about going all the way back to the origins of life and the simplest possible forms of the kind of thing I am that makes, I think, a useful starting place, a useful grounding. And so I have to go at this work ironically, recognizing that I have this ambivalence about finding out who I am. You probably can relate to the ambivalence, at least you've seen it in other people. When people introspect or try to imagine what they really are, they go spelunking around inside the cave of their motivations and intentions, and they do so gingerly. We do so gingerly. I just want the truth, but it better be flattering. Let the best plan win, and it better be mine. We all have this ambivalence, which I think is part of the irony that I'm arguing is the truest medicine, is that I really am ambivalent about finding out who I am. I want it to be reassuring. I want it to be motivating, comforting. I want it to fill me with hope, and yet I want it to be realistic. We talk about hope and realism as if they're both pure virtues. Always be hopeful, always be realistic. And I don't think that's realistic because often hope and realism are at odds with each other. So that's the struggle I am working with here, and I think it's in all of us. I wouldn't put it past me. I wouldn't put it past anyone to have those issues that they're dealing with. And I am, you could say, done finding impressive those versions of what we are that start at a high level, that assume things like motivation or will or spirit or even information, like we've been talking about. I have to start way lower than that. If I really want to know what I am, I have to explain myself from the ground up. That's what we've been doing here. Now, I could be wrong about my theories about what we are, but I'm trying to see as plainly as possible, and I'm trying not to evoke unexplained explanations that are simply assumed. They're just intuitive categories of phenomena like spirit or information. Remember, I think that I have to explain interpretation if I want to talk about information. Anything can become information, but it only is when it's interpreted by a self for a self, given its effort, which I would call its effort to struggle for existence. As basic as that. I don't struggle for my existence much. I'm living a relatively cushy human life. Many of us are, most of us are, not necessarily compared to others today, but it'd be easy to take for granted our life. We are likely to be alive tomorrow, unlikely to be dead tomorrow. And that's something we have to overcome if we're going to do this kind of research, because actually it's the other way around. Actually, it's very unlikely that a stable entity like me or you should be stable at all. So that's been the burden. I have to explain it from the slightest possible likeliness that a chemical system would not just diffuse. This would be at the origins of life. And how over time we have accumulated more and more ways to stay likely alive. We were very unlikely to stay alive at the origins of life. And over time we have become more likely to stay alive. Or you could say, over time we have become less and less likely to simply fall apart. All the way out to us, humans, where we have the confidence that things will work, that we're not really struggling for our own existence. I often think of myself as kind of like I'm my mind and heart, and they're riding around in this reliable station wagon, which is my body. In fact, I think I am, but I certainly know the impression of myself as that. It's obvious that everything runs smoothly, almost like a machine. I'm like a machine that also thinks. And I'm not the first person to think that. In fact, that's the idea behind Descartes' dualism, the idea that there are two kinds of things, or two realities. There's the physical push-pull three-dimensional realm where basically all animals are machines, and then there's this conscious stuff that floats on top of it. So while I think that's total bunkum, I totally can relate to it. I know what that's like, to feel like, yeah, my body is just a station wagon for my mind. Okay. But what I've had to argue throughout this thing, and an impression I want to convey somehow here, and I don't know how well I'll do it, but something I'm trying to convey is that I actually have to pay attention to how unlikeliness increases. What do I mean by unlikeliness? In chemistry, it's anything goes. Within physical laws, nothing is limiting its own behavior in chemistry. You could say that things are affected by what does work on them. And we see that in the inanimate world in general. A rock is not trying to do anything. It's got no internal capacity. It's buffeted about by whatever, and it could be in all sorts of possible positions. You could say there's equal likeliness just depending on what external pressures the rock is under. It could melt, it could crack, it could be shoved this way, it could be shoved that way. Lots of possibilities, and that would be true of molecules as well. Not anything goes, but a lot of things go. And if you look at you, well, no, it's different. You are constrained in your behavior. You're internally constraining your behavior. There are different processes in you that are keeping each other in check. In balanced check, you could say checks in balance. I know this phrase is checks and balances. That doesn't actually make much sense. Checks in balance. You're a bunch of processes that keep each other in check, making unlikely your own demise. And so I am arguing for a reversal of how we normally think about it. You might have heard this before from me. Goes without saying, but bears repeating. I'm interested in how I ended up with the functional limitations I've got. Imagine this. Imagine that you were reaching for a cup of coffee, and the cup of coffee was, pretty full, no room for milk, that sort of thing, and it's hot. And you reach for it, and your arm can do really just all sorts of things. Let's say you got Parkinson's or any of the illnesses that might cause you an uncoordination where you don't have full control over your hand. And what happens is you end up spilling it all over, maybe get burnt, something like that. Okay, so then what then accounts for your abilities? I'm going to argue that what accounts for your abilities is constraints, deliberations. Your abilities are a product of you refining your behavior down to the behavior that works, not the behavior that doesn't work. And in a way, you kind of already know this about the way we have to go at the question of what we are. If you believe Darwin was onto something. Now, I'll argue Darwin didn't explain life, and Darwin knew he didn't explain life. But Darwin explained how we end up with adaptations that are, you could say, fine-tuned to our circumstances. And it's a process of making some behaviors, some processes, some configurations unlikely. You're eliminating possibilities. When we talk about freedom, what are we talking about? We're talking about freedom to be any which way? No. Why do people want freedom? They want freedom so they can assert their will. What is their will? It's their capacity to constrain themselves down to the behavior that functions for them. So as a result, free will becomes an oxymoron. What we're talking about there is total freedom from external constraints so that we can exercise our internal will. Our willpower is basically our won't power, our ability to prevent ourselves from doing certain things. That's the quest for free will. It's like, that's also the quest of any kind of libertarian ideological maniac who thinks that the solution is freedom. They want total free-for-all or free fall. No, nobody actually wants that. But if you take the words free will, will is about constraining, channeling, focusing your energy where it's good for you or where it feels good for you. And then what would be the freedom? Well, it would be freedom from any constraints on that. Is that really what we want? No, actually, that's not what we want either. We're actually quite ambivalent about freedom and determinism. Ironically, we are torn about it. I want freedom to gain increased advantage. I don't want free fall. I want freedom to rise. I don't want a ceiling that's holding me down from advantages I could get. And I also do want a floor to keep me from bottoming out. So I'm actually quite ambivalent about it. I would like the determinism that keeps me from falling and the freedom to rise. What do I want there? A ratchet. Think about a ratchet. Think about a car jack. What is it? It's that freedom to rise, but not to fall. It's like a one-way valve. And in a way, my description of the origins of life, that whole thing I went through a couple of episodes ago about how you get this kind of ratcheting at the origins. Remember, it's a chain reaction that produces chain reaction seeds as a side product. So that if one of those chain reaction seeds breaks open, the chain reaction might resume. There's not much there, but I will say there's a little bit of will. That is a little bit of constraint that keeps it or makes it less likely that it will die compared to any other dissipative chemical system. And what is it? It's actually a ratchet. When it's open in the chain reaction form, it's growing its population of parts that could work together. When it's closed, it's locked down like a ratchet. So freedom to rise and prevention of falling. And in that rising, as I described in the last session, in that rising, there's even the potential for evolving, not just making multiple seeds, which is essential to reproduction. You can't just reproduce yourself at replacement rate. Things fall apart too quickly. What I'm talking about is that because it opens up and becomes this chain reaction that has freedom, the parts are very unconstrained. They're relatively unconstrained when they're in the chain reaction process. But they can evolve. It's kind of an open system that way. And that's where I got that second ratchet. On top of the basic ratchet of a chain reaction that produces chain reaction seeds, we got another feature that I argued could evolve once you got what we call a minimal autogen. And this is a responsive autogen. This is an autogen that is more likely to break open when there is fuel for the chain reaction than otherwise. Well, that's also a ratchet. And so in a way, all of our habits, or what we call adaptations, are ratchets. There are ways to take advantage of an opportunity when it comes along and not take advantage when there is no opportunity. So you remember I mentioned this as something kind of fundamental that I see from the origins of life all the way out to my personal life. The autogen, this chain reaction that produces chain reaction seeds, it's not just replication. It's not just reproducing itself. It's a dynamic that has to keep itself going. For that, it's got to regenerate itself faster than it degenerates. It's got two basic jobs. One is to protect against degeneration and repair and the other is to repair what degenerates about it. Well, repair takes energy. And the problem is that energy tends to degenerate things. Fires are highly energetic, and yet they don't organize things usually. There's got to be this kind of ratchet where you take in the energy you can use to grow yourself, but keep out the energy that would undermine you. And that's you busy doing the prevention of your own undoing. That's what I'm arguing is there at the origins of life. Doing the prevention of your own undoing. That would be repairing yourself. And it's ratchet-like, and it plays out all the way to you. You know this feeling. You know it not just as a function of staying alive. You have to take in the energy that you can use to regenerate yourself, not the energy that will degenerate you. That's the same thing as eating food, not poison. Being careful what you eat. That's what we're talking about. But you also know it at the feeling level and the thought level. And this is where irony is essential. Because I'm a human being, which means that I take in food, not poison. It also means that since I have feelings and some ideas make me disappointed in myself and others make me proud of myself, I'm very likely to treat the ones that encourage me as food and the ones that discourage me as poison. What are we talking about? We're talking about confirmation bias. Everybody's got it. An ironist recognizes that their confirmation bias is a problem that they have to manage. The anti-ironist or absolutist or asshole or gaslighter or narcissist, whatever you want to call them, I'm not particular about the name. I do tend to use the name hero bot because it's accurate and descriptive. It's robotically playing hero. These are people who treat confirmation bias as a solution to all of their problems. If anybody has something to learn, it's anybody but me. The problem is never me. It's always someone else. Don't discourage me. Be nice. Be kind. Be loving. Be empathic. That would become a standard move made by any absolutist. It's a way of ratcheting absolutely. So nothing can affect you that would cause you any indigestion. You don't have to swallow any ideas that cause you any indigestion at all. You're closed that way. And that's why it feels like such a perfect ratchet. You only get encouraging news. This is also the problem with the power of positive thinking, which is really, at its root, the power of don't say anything that disappoints me and never allow a discouraging word to be heard. And I totally get that appetite. I would understand why any of us, me included, would want to get to that place where we have prevented all potential buzzkills. Well, the problem is we won't survive if we have that attitude or if we get in that habit. And that's why I do all that work at a high level, that is at the human level, to try and understand, cultivate irony, to cultivate an approach where we need our ratchet. I need my encouragement more than, I will be always more receptive to encouragement than discouragement. I'm more likely to read slowly and twice a love letter than a bit of hate mail. I'll tend to speed read the hate mail and come up with my rebuttal on a dime. But I recognize that, and I have to manage it, which also means that I have to exercise my appetites for self-flattery in safe ways, not dangerous ways. Well, I seem to be all over the map again. I'm going to touch on something that is up these days in our research, and it might be of interest to you, and I'll say more about it as I go on with this series in which I'm freeing myself to get long-winded. It's got to do with this question that's been on people's minds lately. What is consciousness? And I'm no neuroscientist, but I think I'm beginning to get a sense of what my research colleague, who's a full professor of neuroscience at Berkeley, and before that, a professor of neuroscience at Harvard, thinking about it. I'm going to make a stab at it. I'm going to try to give you a sense of how we're thinking about it these days. So, the question of consciousness is not the same as this question of what makes humans different. We assume that there's conscious experience in animals, though not in plants. But in animals, there is conscious experience. And what do we mean by it? Well, the term of art these days in science is qualia. Qualia is the experience or sensation of some phenomena, some information. For example, if you see red, if you take in the information that something is, why is there a feeling of redness? If everything you do is mechanical, ultimately mechanical, the impulse of molecules interacting with each other, and nothing you do defies the laws of physics and chemistry, why do you feel anything? And why do you feel disappointment? Sure, but also, why do you even feel redness? Why can a word evoke a feeling or a sensation? Why is there any kind of quality to it? It seems inexplicable. And many will argue that it is inexplicable. It's one of many popular approaches to the consciousness issue, which is that we cannot explain it, or at least that it's the hardest problem for us to deal with. That's called the hard problem. Why is there qualia? Why is there experience at all? I think of it as the made harder problem because, no, it's not like plants are just push and pull interaction of molecules within machines. They are a constrained subset, a self-constraining subset of push and pull interactions. They are selves that are making unlikely their own demise. A plant, an amoeba, all of them. So if you want to start with the assumption that we're nothing but computers or machines or something like that, yeah, you're going to have a hell of a time figuring out what qualia is. But if you start with an explanation for the struggle for existence, and then build up without any smoke and mirrors, without any kind of added inexplicable explanations like there's information processing or something like, if you actually explain what we are with continuity, deep etiology, it's not as hard. But having said that, the burden is now on me to say something about what it's like and why we would have this experience. Well, one of the problems with how people think about minds or brains is that we draw a parallel to computers. And I've been thinking about this in the last couple of days. This has been interesting to me. A simile is saying something like, a mind is like a computer. A metaphor is saying, mind is a computer. So that you drop the like. That's about rhetoric, a rhetorical art of saying whether choosing, for example, whether to say life is like a waterfall or life is a waterfall. But it's more than that. When we move towards metaphor, where we simply say that two things we're comparing are the same, life is a waterfall, minds are computers, things get easier. We don't have to keep a track of the differences between two kinds of things, the parallels and contrasts, the ways in which they're alike and the ways in which they're not. No, we get to treat one like it's the other. And so God is a human being in the sky. Wine is Christ's blood. minds are computers, all of those moves, whatever they are, liberals are vermin, whatever. Once you drop the like, it's likable because it's easy. Okay, coming back to consciousness. We tend to assume that a brain is a bunch of switches, elaborate, complicated switches, that, like any of the switches in our computers, they get the energy they need and don't get the energy they don't need. I was talking to a Silicon Valley friend the other day who explained to me that actually the design of computer circuits has gotten easy. That's not the hard part. The hard part is exactly what I just described, which is preventing overheating, preventing the failure of sufficient energy getting to different parts within a chip. But once a chip is well designed, and once you're using it, you don't have to pay any attention to the energy is free. It's just assumed that when a switch has to switch, there's the energy necessary to make that switch. And on top of that, we got this problem with MRIs, which is MRIs show us areas of the brain that light up, which is all very well, but it's actually relative metabolism. The brain is active all the time. It's all hair trigger. It's not like there are silent regions the way there might be within a computer chip. So, yeah, there are some parallels between chips and brains, but not many, and certainly far fewer than we assume when we assume that energy is free and always available to the neurons and that the neurons light up or go completely inactive. That's not what's going on in the brain. So according to Terrence Deacon, the guy who came up with this theory, I'm just trying to find more and more intuitive ways to talk about it. And I'm offering up one right here because I think it's actually fantastic and completely relatable. So this is not going to sound like rocket science or neuroscience. It's going to sound completely human. You just wait. Okay. Neurons are not quite like other cells. Other cells are more quiescent. That is, they are not as hyperactive as neurons are. They don't replicate. Then they're fixed in position. And you know this about neurons. They're the first to die. They're actually extremely fragile. If you don't have oxygen for a few minutes, they begin to die off. And also, an individual neuron is, you could say, a little more autonomous than your regular cells. That is, it's slightly more independent. It's more fragile. It doesn't reproduce. And it sits there in what I'm going to argue is basically, you can think of it as like a colony of bioflora. Every neuron is a little alive, individually, independently. And they're in this teeming network of other neurons that they're reacting to or reacting with. I think it's not far off. Don't take my word for it, but I think it's not too far off to think of them as like a colony of bioflora that are in this confusing relationship with your body. They don't do well when they don't get sufficient energy for the job at hand, whatever task they have to do in their neighborhood, given what activity there is. They also are disadvantaged when they're getting too much energy, when they're getting an overdose of something. So they're overdose of basically oxygen and glucose. We're talking here about the relationship between neurodynamics, dynamics meaning change, and hemodynamics, hemo being blood. So what I'm talking about here is really the relationship between neurodynamics and hemodynamics. Dynamics just means change. And there's all sorts of hyperactive change. You can think of your brain or your nervous system as an economy of where every individual is putting out and taking in depending on basically reacting to external circumstances that shift your attention around, but also internal interactions and all of that. So you've got all of that neuronal change going on at a very fast rate. And 3 orders of magnitude slower, you've got the blood flow changes. So just try this out. I know this is going to sound a little like a first pass, but I'm just trying to figure out how to articulate it. I'm going to give it a try here. So it's kind of like you. Imagine being a neuron. And your demands for energy, resources, whatever they are, they change over time. And you're hustling to keep the balance right. If you're underfed, you're at a disadvantage. It can actually wear you out if you're underfed. It could also wear you out to be overfed, and you're trying to keep the flow working right for you. It's not at all like being a computer switch where the energy's right there. The energy comes to you late. Let's say this is before the days of Amazon and you order something and it takes 3 days to get to you, or you order too many of something and now you got this disadvantage and you got to return some stuff. And so you're part of this economy and you want what you want, need what you need when you need it right away. But there are these lag times. Terry is making the case that those lag times are the qualia. That is, what we feel is a incompatibility between what's demanded by the neuron and what's supplied by the blood, because the system runs slowly. So what I'm actually suggesting, this will sound weird, is that once you have a nervous system, you are actually systems in a tug-of-war with each other. They're not completely independent. The shifts in where blood flows within the nervous system to supply to the immediate need is actually controlled by the brain, but there's still a lag time. It's still a little bungee-like. That is, you get this, the flow is too strong, the flow is too fast, the flow is too slow for where it's demanded now. It keeps on shifting around. Your neurons are a little bit jerked around by that slowness, and you feel it as qualia. So let's imagine, for example, that you're talking and then someone interrupts you, or someone interrupts who you're talking to. You got a certain momentum. You've got your attention on what you're saying, and suddenly you kind of come to a grinding stop because you can't talk, but you have this momentum, you have this inertia. You're a little bit like, imagine, trying to stop a truck, and the truck will skid forward. It's still got momentum, but it's also stopping. And so there's a kind of a tension in there. Or imagine that you get to the store where you really need to get something and it turns out it's closed. Those are examples of visceral disappointment, but also visceral qualia. You feel it inside you. Or imagine that you're at the gym and you're working with a personal coach and you're counting your reps and you don't like doing your reps because they're actually painful, and you count and you think you're on the number 10 when they start counting and they say 8. You feel that visceral difference. It's like a disappointment, like the truck that's trying to stop and yet it's still got momentum. I'm suggesting that in both directions, I'm only here talking about the most obvious, most visceral kind of momentum, but the pain or disappointment we experience as qualia when we have to change where our attention goes, that is, I'm arguing, that's a lens that will give you a sense of where to look for qualia. The other problem with the hard problem, as defined, is it doesn't actually get around to explaining who the self is, who is experiencing qualia. So when they talk about it, they talk like, okay, well, you're just a machine, not really a self in a way. And then they say, okay, yeah, but how could there be qualia inside of a machine? No, you're a self. And actually, in a way, I'm suggesting a possibility that you are two selves that are kind of in tug-of-war with each other. They totally depend upon each other. It's a little bit like a couple. You know what it's like to get too much attention from your partner or not enough attention from your partner and to feel a little wobbly as a result. The first book I ever wrote was called Negotiate with Yourself and Win. I'm suggesting that there's a kind of coupleness between the nervous system and the body being the sluggish capacity to produce energy on time for the parts that are your neurons, and that it is this weird kind of relationship between, you could say, a microbiome colony that is the nervous system interacting with soma or body, your vegetative sentience, what you have in common with plants. Because I'm arguing you do. It's this basic capacity to keep yourself alive, to prevent your own death, to keep doing your own undoing. That's what I'm suggesting we have in common with plants and the simplest possible organisms. And yet we have this added self, which is the brain, and there's a little bit of a tug-of-war. And notice the problem with going full-on metaphoric, which is that the brain is like a computer. One of the problems I'm pointing to here is you never have problems with a well-designed computer. You never have problems with overkill or with overfed or underfed in terms of energy. Your computer, a working computer, is not sluggish. Any machine is like this. The whole point is to supply the energy where it's needed, not where it's not needed. And the parallel I'm drawing just at the end of this, and it's a loose parallel at that, is think about it as a relationship, as a couple's relationship. Your partner may or may not be able to supply what you need at the time you need it. And they may oversupply. They may be more than you need, more than you want sometimes. And that's also a tug of war. And I'll also say that I think that's one of the many possible reasons why it's getting harder for us to couple than it used to be. We have less patience for that. And why? We could say AI is going to bring about problems where people won't need partners because they'll have someone who's ready with the energy and affection and reassurance exactly when needed. I think we also got that going with computers. I'll speak for myself here. My computer is reliable. I keep it that way. When I change some parameter within it, it stays changed. I don't have to worry about it at all. It's kind of like the ideal companion. It's the perfect servant for me. So when I go out into the outer world and actually talk to real human beings, I find them somewhat disappointing because they have their own preferences. They kind of yank me around a little bit. People are the worst. I'm kidding there. But I'm pointing out this difference in something I've referred to as Robo-Envy. We'd kind of like it if we and other people were more like computers. Exactly the energy we needed, exactly when we need it, everything we need, nothing we don't need, and completely set in our ways, completely, confidently able to handle all the changes that come our way. It's not just AI that should worry us. It's the whole way in which we are automating our lives and making things way more efficient than people can ever be. And so all the more reason for me to try to figure out what people really are so I can deal with them more effectively. I do like this line from Alan Watts about the Tao, or about Wei Wu Wei, doing, not doing. He said, the lifestyle of one who follows Wei Wu Wei in the Tao must be thought of as a form of intelligence. That is, knowing the patterns, structures, and trends of human and natural affairs so well that one uses the least energy dealing with them. Lifestyle of one who follows a Tao must be understood as a form of intelligence. That is, knowing the patterns, structures, and trends of human and natural affairs well enough that one uses the least amount of energy dealing with them. Yeah, that would be like a robot. All right, I'll be back. That's this week's episode. I was at my daughter's wedding. I've been away, but I'll be back and do these sessions like clockwork.